The night the Barracuda arrived, lightning kept sketching the car in and out of the rain like a bad photograph. I remember the way the bay lights in Dale's shop threw the oil-black paint into thin silver filigree, how each bolt of light seemed to roll along the hood and leave a memory behind it. We hauled it in on a flatbed because that's the sort of car you don't trust to arrive by its own will after 30 years of being left to remember someone else's night. I'd been at Dale's auto service long enough to know the smell of that place by heart. Solvent on the counter, engine grease that never quite came off your skin, the metallic tang of radiator coolant, and, on damp evenings, the concrete in Bay 2 absorbing rain until it breathed it back out as a low, wet heat. I was 26 and had worked for Dale since high school, turning wrenches, sweeping up the bits of other people's lives that came undone. I wasn't supposed to be the one to tangle with ghosts. I liked cars because they made sense. Tight tolerances, bolts, manuals. You could diagnose a problem and fix it. You couldn't do that with people. Dale met the flatbed at the end of the drive, his jacket soaked all the way through. He looked like someone who'd slept in a dream and woken to another person's life. He didn't say much. He never did. He had a habit of keeping his counsel folded like the paper receipts he kept in the register. Jimbo was there too, leaning against the compressor, chewing on a toothpick as if he could chisel the weather into something useful. "Tommy," Dale said when I ducked under the hood for a closer look, "you'll want to see the paperwork. It's in the glove box." The glove box smelled of old vinyl and something sweeter beneath the oil. Jasmine, faint, but there in the plasticky dark like an afterthought. I remember thinking it odd. Jasmine didn't belong to garages. Inside the glove box, atop a brittle stack of registration papers and a faded insurance card, there was a laminated card, the kind motel clerks used to hand out in other people's childhoods. Someone had punched holes in the corners and threaded it with a frayed string so it could hang from a mirror. Someone had written in a careful, blocky hand, "Rules for dealing with the Barracuda. 1. Never leave the mirror uncovered at night. If the mirror moves, do not look away. 2. Do not run the radio alone after midnight. If it clicks between stations, shut the ignition and wait 5 minutes before restarting. 3. If Jasmine appears where it should not, leave the bay and do not return until sunrise. 4. Photographs, letters, or names scratched into the paint are to be documented and left undisturbed until consulted by Dale. 5. If any person feels watched or ill while working on the vehicle, stop work immediately and call someone, preferably Dale." I read them twice, slow, like you do with a stop sign on a blind hill. The card was laminated badly, bubbles under the plastic, edges peeling. The ink had bled in places from humidity, the handwriting tidy but smudged where a thumb had rested for years. Jimbo snorted from the compressor and pushed off, coming around the fender to peer at the rules. "Old shop superstitions," he said. "People like rules when they don't know what happened. Makes the dark feel organized." "People made those rules for a reason," Dale said, quiet and gravelly. "You want to laugh, you laugh, but we stick to 'em." That was the thing about Dale. He kept his hands steady and his face closed, but his neck and shoulders carried stories you could not get out of a man with a pry bar. He remembered the town the way other men remembered children. He could tell you who fell in love behind the hardware store and who had left without a word in 1984. When he said, "we stick to 'em," he meant he'd signed more checks with names he shouldn't have, that he'd hidden things in the trunk of older cars to keep them from people who would make trouble. Working at Dale's means learning his rules without asking why. You do it because the shop is a place that keeps you whole. The Barracuda sat like a dark promise under the bay light. Its oil-black paint had the depth of a well. You could drop your face into it and lose years. The interior smelled of cigarette smoke and old perfume. The upholstery faded along the driver's side like the imprint of a body that had sat there a very long time. On the passenger seat was a photograph in a plastic sleeve, black and white, a girl with a smile that hadn't stopped streaming towards something. Someone had written along the white margin, Carolyn Marsh, July 1971. Carolyn Marsh. The name felt like a bell in a town we'd all heard before but hadn't bothered to ring. She'd been dead 40 years, at least by the dates. Her death was a footnote in county records, a hit and run on a July night, a car that fled, an investigation that ran into a wall of silence. People moved on when they could. Sometimes a ghost follows. We pulled the car into Bay 2 and let it sit while we went through the paperwork. The flatbed driver had his own story, some renter who'd driven the Barracuda up from a storage lot on the county line. "Found it in a barn," he said, wiping his hands on his jacket. "Owners said bring it to Dale's. Said don't let anyone alone with it." "You told him you'd follow rules?" Jimbo asked. He shrugged. He said it had its ways. Said the folks in Lancaster know the sort. There are moments when towns fold into themselves, like a shirt that's been pressed too many times. I felt it then, the sense that the Barracuda wasn't just a car, but a space, where time folded back on itself. The jasmine in the glove box was more than a scent, it was a key. I didn't believe in ghosts the way a preacher believes in scripture, but there are patterns you learn as a mechanic. Metal remembers heat. Paint remembers scratches. A mirror remembers the angle of the face that has looked into it. The first night, we backed the Barracuda into the bay. I left the mirror uncovered because the rules said so and because Dale insisted. The mirror faced the doorway, and in its glass I saw my own face and the guttering out there beyond the fluorescent light. When the night came and the shop emptied to the sound of the rain, the mirror skimmed. It wasn't a big movement, more of a suggestion that something had turned its head. The radio clicked 2 stations into a thin, hollow song between them. Static spun in the speakers like flies. Then there was a line of music, thin as a thread, cracked through with static, and a voice that sounded like a record someone had left at the bottom of a drawer. It was an old song, something with a slow piano, the kind you heard in diners through a steam of coffee and a cigarette haze. I remember the hairs on my forearms standing up. Jimbo heard it too, but he told me later he'd thought it was the AM spitting out an old recording. "Don't turn it up," Dale said from the doorway of the office, and I realized he'd been watching from behind his desk. He had a cup of coffee, cooling, and a stack of notebooks under his arm. We worked on the Barracuda in pieces. Dale wanted it moved far enough into the shop to keep it from the weather, then left me and Jimbo to inventory the car for obvious things: brakes, tires, battery. The car's odometer had frozen decades ago at a number that suggested someone had been driving less than 20,000 miles a year. The glove box held more than the laminated rules. There were letters, brittle at the edges, tied with string and folded carefully, as if someone had practiced folding them until they fit the creases. One letter was addressed to Caroline, in a handwriting that was blunt, perhaps male, and the ink had blurred where a thumb had been wet with rain. I took a photo of the letter with my phone because that's what people do now when they don't trust keeping paper in a shop. Old habits meet new, but the content was the same whether you scrolled it or read it on paper. The letter was small, a single page. Caroline, I can't bring myself to say what happens without saying your name. It sits in my mouth like a stone. If you are out in the world after tonight, forgive me. If you are gone, remember the pond. Remember how we used to sneak out and listen to the frogs. I'm keeping the Barracuda on the corner of 9th. W. There's an awkward apology in the handwriting, a shame you can see in the loop of the T's. I clipped the letter and slid it into an evidence sleeve Dale had pulled from a desk drawer. He frowned when he read the initial and the mention of the Barracuda. W, he said, Holbrook. Warren Holbrook. The name had the kind of weight that makes people drop their voices. I hadn't heard it a lot in town. He was the sort of man who had money and did not advertise the fact, who showed up at planning meetings and gave a deliberate, patient smile to the widows of men he'd bought land from. He'd been a developer, a civic donor, and a man who liked to keep his hands clean in public. He died in 2003, the record said, after a brief illness on a day when the obituaries were full of chestnuts about his generosity. That he should appear in a yellowed letter from the early 70s made the air in the shop thin. "You're poking a hornet's nest," Jimbo said, not unkindly, when I told him I wanted to look into it. "Some things warm up when you leave them alone." "Some things make you keep looking," I said. "Caroline was a person. Her name's on that photo. Someone left those letters tied like a promise." Dale listened, then put his coffee down and tapped ash into an overfull tray. "I won't have you mucking around Lancaster Records without an escort," he said. "You go poking in old wounds, and people get uncomfortable. Holbrook had friends who made discomfort a nuisance." "I'm not a brave man. Mostly, I am curious. Curiosity leads you into small, dangerous acts. You drive by the old house just to see if the curtains are the same color. You ask a neighbor about the night something happened, and they look at you like you're poking the dead. But curiosity is also what makes a story worth retelling. I wanted Caroline's story, not because I wanted to prove anything about ghosts, but because the idea of someone being left unremembered sat in my chest like a rusted nail. The first leg of the investigation was simple in method but delicate in execution. You start with the things people leave behind. You go to the library, where microfiche waits like a history of moths. You sit under the humming light of the county records office and ask for accident reports. You talk to people who remembered and note how their memories tangle with the absent facts. The library was a small room with a smell like old paper and lemon oil. Gail Brenneman, the Gazette reporter who'd been covering county stories for longer than I'd worked for Dale, sat at a table surrounded by clippings. "You're behind this?" she asked when I came in with a thumbnail of a letter and Dale's permission scrolled on a piece of shot paper. Her hair was pulled back tight, her glasses catching the light like a tiny stage light. Gail had a way of looking at you that made you feel like the important part of a witness statement. "I'm not a journalist," I said. "I work on cars. There's a Barracuda in Dale's lot with Caroline Marsh's name in it." She pursed her lips. Caroline Marsh. That name's been quiet for a while. Her sister, Dorothy, I think, used to come into my office sometimes with pie and an insistence that somebody care. People died, folks moved on. That's how towns survive. "Do you remember Holbrook?" I asked. Gail's eyes narrowed. "Warren Holbrook was the sort of man who never had to answer to a lot of people. Back then, he had influence. They quieted things. People were afraid. If I write anything, it's going to stir up a hornet's nest. But if you have documents, if you can show me a letter, a name, then I'll look." She gave me access to the microfiche and a list of old clippings. In the Gazette's pages from July 1971, the accident report is a single column. Late-night accident on Route 6, pedestrian fatality, unidentified vehicle fled the scene. There was a small note that said witnesses reported the car as dark in color, fast, and without headlights. No arrest was made. The county detective at the time had written in a follow-up memo that community cooperation had been minimal. The memo read, in that flat, bureaucratic script that tells you the human heart darkened long before it left the room, "I have exhausted leads. No physical evidence recovered. Family notified. Case remains open." There's a cruelty to that bureaucratic voice that's colder than any ghost. It sits like a stone in your shoe. You imagine letters that were never followed up on, witnesses who saw too much and said too little. You imagine a town that looked away. Dorothy Marsh was not hard to find. She lived in a low house with chipped paint and a garden that had gone all summer to seed. She answered the door in a cardigan that smelled like lemon and aftershave. I told her I worked at Dale's and that I'd found a photograph and some letters. Her hands trembled when she took the photo. She set it on the kitchen table as if it were the sun. She liked jasmine, Dorothy said, after a long silence, eyes on the photograph like it was a closed window she'd been waiting to open. It grew by the fence at the Marsh place. Her mother used to braid it into her hair. On July nights, her hair smelled like the weed. "Did she—" I started, then realized how crude it sounded to ask a widow's sister the bluntness of loss. "Caroline was walking home," Dorothy said. "She had been at the picture show with a friend. They left late. She said she'd take the long way past Route 6 to see the stars. She liked to count satellites. The car hit her, Tommy. She didn't have time to see who it was. They never found who. Her voice was small, but there was no chalking it up to fate. She spoke with the steady, brutal arithmetic of someone who'd added every Sunday for 40 years and found the numbers wanting. I left Dorothy with the photograph between us and a plate of cookies she offered, though neither of us touched them. Outside on the porch, the jasmine in her yard was choked and viney, white bells half closed in the humidity. The scent brushed my cheek with a memory that was not mine. The more I looked, the more there seemed to be pieces that refused to fit into neat squares. The Barracuda's paint had a small patch near the rear bumper where someone, long ago, had attempted to smooth over a scratch. Under the scuff, if you held it to the light, you could see the beginning of letters. An S, perhaps an H. Names get scratched into cars the way grief gets scratched into people. Someone tries to hide them and the memory pushes like a root. At the records office, I sat at a long table with brittle files and a clerk who had a tattoo of an anchor on his forearm and the patience of someone who opens old dead letters for a living. The county's accident report on Caroline was thin. There was a mention of a vehicle described as late model, dark color, and witness accounts vary. But in the registry of vehicle sales, there was an odd notation. A 1970 Plymouth, title transferred in late 1970 to a Holbrook, Warren H., with a transferred lien. The title was signed over to someone in 1972, an assignment that made no names match our letters. Warren Holbrook's name kept cropping up in the small print of decades. A donation here, an improvement fund there, a man who gave to the courthouse roof and the school's renovation. He did business with people who preferred to keep their hands free of messy things. He also liked cars. There's an ugly truth in small towns about people who can buy forgiveness with utility. That's not the kind of justice that satisfies a damaged name. When did Holbrook die? I asked the records clerk. 2003, he said without looking up. Obituaries in microfiche, pneumonia, complications. There's a photograph of his funeral in the Gazette, lots of suits. The records confirmed what the letters hinted at. Holbrook's connection to the Barracuda was not anonymous. Whoever W was kept a careful distance in the note, then used W like a way to apologize. That was enough to point me at a face that already had a shadow. We started following other leads as delicately as you unspool a thread from a tapestry. Gail wrote a short piece that asked questions people had stopped asking. The Gazette ran it as a column inquiry, more memory than accusation, asking if anyone had recollections of a 1970 Plymouth Barracuda on the night of July 1971. The comments came slowly, then faster. An old man at the corner who said he'd seen a car without headlights. A woman who'd been married then and remembered the town's night air like it had a different density. People called us with the little truths they could bear. They had seen something, they had known something, but they had not wanted to cause trouble. The supernatural occurrences at the shop escalated as the investigation threaded itself into public memory. At first they were small. The jasmine would bloom at odd times, a single cluster on the dashboard of the Barracuda with no visible source. The radio would hum a song between stations when nobody was near the controls. The mirror would fog with breath, even in winter. Jimbo joked about the car looking for company, but his jokes were frayed. He started sleeping with an empty drawer of tools open beside him and kept both hands on the steering wheel when he drove home late. He told me he felt watched, that his wool shirt felt like the hand of someone else had brushed him in the dark. One night, the mirror moved more than a suggestion. I'd stayed late because the Barracuda had a stubborn fuel pump, and I wanted to make sure it wasn't leaking. The rain had eased to a steady drizzle. The radio was off. The shop hummed with the small noises of machines cooling. I had my head under the hood, a flashlight between my teeth, when the mirror turned. It turned with deliberation, like a person finding a thread and pulling. I remember the cold. The air in the bay dropped 3 degrees as if someone had opened a door to the winter. My breath fogged in front of me, though the heater in the shop was still on. In the mirror, the glass caught a movement at the edge. The brief sweep of something pale. I straightened and looked up, and there was no one. But the radio by the office crackled, and a thin piano started behind the static. I obeyed Rule 1 and did not look away. I kept my eyes on the mirror, because the rule was not superstitious. It was a way to keep yourself honest. People who turned away from a thing they were afraid of left the door open for that fear to find new furniture. The mirror did not show me my face. It showed the back seat of the Barracuda, as if the car were peering into itself, remembering. The back seat was empty but for a single scrap of paper tucked under the armrest. I got up on the creeper, palms slick, and reached in and pulled it out. It was a list of names, someone's quick shorthand. Caroline at the top, a few other names crossed out, one name underlined aggressively, Holbrook. The handwriting matched the letter's initial W, only in the way men sometimes write, a bluntness of stroke, an avoidance of flourish. My hands shook holding the paper. The shop felt too small, like a throat. I could hear Jimbo's radio through the office door, a baseball game talking in the next room. Dale's footsteps sounded deliberate in the hallway. "You saw it move," Dale said without looking at me. He'd come out of the office like smoke. "You kept looking." "I pulled this out," I said, handing him the list. Dale folded the paper open on his knee and squinted. "Holbrook's on that list. That's not good." "Why would someone cross him out?" I asked. "If he's on the list, why?" "Because sometimes the people who know are afraid. Because sometimes the people who see have a lousy habit of keeping quiet when told to. Because Holbrook had more to lose than the rest of us." That night, everything tightened. The radio's song swelled up, then snapped in the way old speakers do when you press a thumb to the cone. Jimbo said later he'd felt a pressure against his shoulder like a hand, not cruel but absolving, as if someone had run their fingers through his hair and left him honest. There was a jasmine, single blossom, white as bone, resting on the hood of the Barracuda where no plant could have reached. I picked it up and smelled it. It was not sweet. It tasted like apology. "You gonna keep poking?" Jimbo asked me as we stood in the doorway watching the car pull the rain off its body. "I have to know," I said. "Her name's in the glove box. Someone kept letters. That's not nothing." Dale looked at me for a long time. He understood more than he let on. "You write down the rules before you follow them," he said. "You make sure somebody knows where you're going. Remember that." I did. I wrote the rules on the inside of my jacket pocket and put a pen in the front. I told my mother I'd be late that night, which is how you tell someone you're alive without making an appointment to die. I went home with the jasmine between my fingers and a photograph in my pocket. The next day, Gail ran a larger piece. She didn't accuse anyone. She asked about the memories. She said the town might have answers if it wanted to remember. The piece put faces in clouds and pushed people to the edges of their habits. Then something strange and practical happened. The courthouse received a call from a woman who'd once worked as a typist for Holbrook's company. She remembered a ledger where not all transactions were accounted for. It was a small, human thing, admission that someone had kept a book they shouldn't have. And it landed like a coin in a fountain. People started remembering with less fear. The consequences were not immediate, and they were not clean. Investigative momentum in small towns acts like frost. It creeps and hardens and then melts into puddles where you least expect them. A man in our town who'd known Holbrook brought an old camera to Dale's and asked if we could look at the negatives. He swore he'd never meant harm, only remembrance. The negatives were small black windows that, when held to light, showed not weapons but faces at parties, cars glinting at night, a dark vehicle parked on a road that matched witness statements. I learned, slowly, that truth in a small town moves like a reluctant animal. It resists being poked. It gathers friends who keep it safe by burying it under anodyne charity. But truth also has this stubborn quality of its own. Give it a window, and it will climb through. There were nights when the shop felt like the only honest place in Lancaster. People came by with scraps, memories, and the brittle courage of those who had kept a secret too long. Dorothy came in once with a thermos of tea and stood by the Barracuda with her hand over her mouth. "I'm not sure why I'm here," she said, and then began to talk in the way that people do when a lock has been picked in their chest. She told us things that did not help an investigation, but did help our understanding of Caroline. She told us that Caroline had been a singer in the church choir, that she kept a list of songs, that she loved the smell of jasmine, and once wore a dress the color of late summer wheat to a dance. Those small human details were lifelines. They made the Barracuda not just a car, but a container of a life. Not everyone wanted truth. A man named Richard Mallory, who owned a construction supply company that had done contracts for Holbrook for years, stopped delivering materials to Dales under the pretext of scheduling conflicts. He called Dale a fool for dredging up things that made people nervous. "That's how we eat, Dale," he said on the phone. "You don't go digging where men have buried their reputations." When confrontation started to look like a risk, Jimbo's jokes ran out. He fell off a ladder at home 2 days after a late night at the shop, more clumsy than injured, and came in with a head wound stitched up and a story about tripping over the cat. He said it was nothing, but he quit coming in before lunch and later told us the doctor had suggested he keep his head steady and avoid heavy lifting. Dale closed the office door and told me to be careful. We kept the rules. We did not run the radio alone after midnight, though once or twice it clicked open on its own and we heard a line of an old record that sounded like someone calling a name. We did not cover the mirror. We documented each blossom of jasmine and put it in an evidence sleeve for the photo record. It felt absurd and religious at the same time, like a ritual that had no priest. I kept a notebook where I logged each oddity: date, time, scent, sound. It read like a mechanic's ledger for the supernatural. There are skeptics for whom patterns are only statistics, but pattern itself is testimony. The list of scratched names I'd found, a half-dozen names with Holbrook underlined, suggested a ledger of favors owed or secrets traded. In the corner of the list, someone had written, faintly, the words, "Don't look away." That was the same sentence that had been the first rule on the laminated card in the glove box. Whoever made those rules had tried to build armor for people who wanted to remember. The deeper I dug, the more I saw that the Barracuda had been a place where memory accumulated like road dust. It had been bought and sold by hands that needed a particular kind of anonymity. It had ferried someone to a place where a life ended and a story nearly stopped. One night, after a long day with the records clerk and a long argument over whether to publish our small findings, I stayed at the shop because the rain had made it pointless to go home. The radio was off. The mirror faced the doorway like a watchful pupil. I was cleaning tools when the bay light flickered thrice and went out. I froze, thinking of a blown fuse. But Dale's hand landed on my shoulder behind me. He had a flashlight, the beam narrow and honest. He pointed it at the Barracuda. The jasmine scent came like a tide, full and immediate, the white notes pushing into the air like someone exhaling through a scarf. The mirror fogged over with breath, though no one stood close enough to make that mark. In the fog was a shape, pale, like the impression of a hand on glass. For a heartbeat I thought it might have been my own breath, but the air around me was still. Then the radio, which had been dead a moment before, sputtered, and a voice, thin, unmistakable, came through. It was not an answering voice, not Dale's or Jimbo's. It was a voice that spoke a name. Tommy. I dropped the flashlight. It clacked on the concrete. I'd never been called like that by an empty room. The voice had the small, precise accent of someone who'd lived in Lancaster. It had the way of a person calling a neighbor at a back door. The sound hurt like a bell. I didn't run. I stood there, because there are kinds of courage you only discover when something calls your name and you are the only person who can answer. I walked to the radio. The speaker was old and warm, and the voice on it was gone. A single jasmine blossom lay on the dash like a price. On the list we found later, under the crossed names, someone had written, "For the remembering." There was an ache to it that felt like a prayer without a God. Dale came up beside me and put his hand on the dash. He didn't speak for a long time. When he did, his voice was all business, the way it was when he told me to torque bolts to spec. "We either finish this," he said, "or we let her keep doing it in the dark." That was the promise I made without saying it. I had started this because Caroline's name had been left in the glove box like a pebble, and I had to make something true out of what someone had abandoned. If the Barracuda was the box that kept Caroline's life sealed, then we would pry it open and let the light in, even if the light hurt. The rules were not superstition. They were scaffolding. They were the only way to work close to a wound without smashing it. And in that knowledge, the real work began. Digging through old files, asking people who wanted to forget to remember, and keeping vigil in a shop that had become a cemetery of sorts, where memories could be tended rather than ignored. It was not going to be quick. Small towns remember slowly. Ghosts, it turned out, have patience. So did we. The Barracuda kept its secrets like a closed mouth, but it had a way of opening, sometimes with a jasmine blossom, sometimes with a radio line. And when it did, you felt the weight of things that people refused to say aloud. That night, with the shop quiet and the rain tapping out a slow metronome on the metal roof, I understood the shape of the work ahead. Find each scratched name, track the places where the car had been and the people who had seen it, and, if the town would permit, call the man who'd been powerful enough to keep names quiet to account in the only way that mattered to a dead girl. We closed the office door and logged the radio incident like any other oddity. Jimbo didn't come in the next day. He called to say he'd had some headaches, not to be dramatic, and that he needed a break. He said, in a voice like someone holding on to the last of a laugh, that he'd been under a car and something had scraped his arm from the inside. The doctor had put in stitches. It was a small thing in a world of larger small things, but it made the edges of my courage sharper. I kept a list in the shop. Names of witnesses, dates of clippings, pages of the Gazette with Gale's column circled. I learned that small acts have dominoes. One story out in the air makes another person remember a ledger. Another calls and asks to look at negatives. A camera comes forward with a photo of a dark car at night. The past collects into present, and the present kept breaking into the shop in small ways. A scent, a song, a name on a list. Each time we observed the rules, less disaster followed. Each time a rule was bent, something like a warning scraped a nail across the skin of the world. On a Tuesday, I took the Barracuda's photograph to the Fairfield County Historical Society. An old volunteer named Mabel ran her hand over the image like dust and said, "I knew a Caroline once," then paused as if she'd said more than the room could hold. She pulled out a ledger with names and dates and shoved it toward me. "Maybe you ought to read," she said. "Maybe it'll tell you what you need." In the ledger, under donations for a summer fair, someone had written, "In memory of Caroline Marsh." The entry read, July 1971, amount small, a notation of flowers at the service. Another notation, months later, referred to a donation from Holbrook for repairs to the fairgrounds, listed as anonymous in the published minutes. These were the small acts of life that do not look like guilt or confession, but have the same shade. They told a story of a town that had paid for comfort and then wrapped it in a ribbon. It was in those ledger margins and in the thin strips of light that fell across the Barracuda's hood that I began to understand what Caroline wanted. She wanted the town to name her again. She wanted someone to find the person who had driven away. She wanted the scratch on the car to be read like a sentence. In short, she wanted her story not to be eaten by the years. We kept working with paper and memory and the rules. Each day pulled us a little further from what is comfortable and a little nearer to what will hurt. The Barracuda, for its part, behaved like a history that has been turned over and asked to speak. It answered in small ways. A jasmine blossom placed on the driver's seat, a radio that hummed a name, a mirror that fogged with breath. Sometimes it answered with a blankness that felt like refusal. It was never theatrical in the way a cheap movie would do it. That kind of restraint makes fear more intimate. It makes it our problem. The town began to bend in our direction in small ways. People who had kept quiet called. A woman at the laundromat handed me a scrap of receipt paper with Holbrook scrawled in the corner. A man at the bar said he'd seen a dark car on Route 6 the night of July 9th. We started to have enough pieces that the shape of an answer looked like it might one day be assembled. But answers in Lancaster had costs. There are always people who prefer the comfortable fiction to the awkward fact. There are always men whose reputations are built like small houses with foundations of other people's silence. The harder we pushed, the more we felt the weight of those foundations. One night, late, the radio whispered again, and the mirror turned with intent. This time the voice was not thin. It had a clarity that cut the space between the dash and the ceiling. It said plainly, "He drove." The radio did not say a name then. It did not need to. The name had been written enough times on enough pieces of paper. The town had murmured about it like an undercurrent. The ledger had named it. My own notebook had recorded it. When the shop lights blinked and came back, we all knew the moment had ratified itself. It was not supernatural theater, but a confirmation. Caroline had offered a fact, not a threat. He drove. That small, devastating piece set us in motion. The question before us ceased to be whether the Barracuda was haunted, and became instead what we were going to do with what it told us. I remember stepping outside into the rain, the street lamp puddles throwing soft light. Dale stayed by the office door, hands in his pockets. Jimbo sat in his truck in the lot with his headlamp off, watching. I felt the town around me like an audience breathless at the act that would follow. What could we do? We could go to the papers. We could tell the sheriff what we had. We could set the name on some altar of happening and let the town either embrace or flinch. There is a kind of justice that is not carried out by courts, but by memory. It takes the shape of a newspaper column, a ledger entry, a headstone. If you cannot hold a man accountable in life, you can make sure his name is not forgiven by quietness. That seemed, in those rain-streaked minutes, not only possible, but necessary. We did not yet know what the cost would be. We did not know how loud a storm might rise from a disturbed foundation. The rules pinned us down like a doctor's instructions. Follow them and you might live to finish. Break them and you invited more danger than you were prepared to meet. But I also knew this. I could not let Caroline's name continue to live in a glove box. I could not let a photograph be the only voice she had on the face of the world. So when Dale looked at me and said, "We do this right," I felt something settle inside me, like a bolt that had been torqued to spec. We were going to open the Barracuda's past, step by careful step, following the laminated rules and the notes, listening for Jasmine, keeping the mirror uncovered. We would go to the records, talk to those who remembered, and, if necessary, force the town to remember. I didn't know then how close the price would come, or that Warren Holbrook's shadow would move closer to our door. I didn't know that a man who had been dead since 2003 could still find ways to make his history feel like a threat. But I did know that the rules, those laminated, bubble-filled commandments, were the only scaffolding we had to hold ourselves upright while we pried at the past. That night, the mirror fogged over again, and in the white blur I thought I saw a hand writing a name. It was so faint that I couldn't be sure, but there it was, the scratch of an H against the dark. I slept poorly. The jasmine scent lingered on my pillow like the memory of a song. The work had only just begun. Morning came slow and gray, the kind of morning that feels like it's been held in reserve for bad news. The jasmine had stopped following me through sleep, but its aftertaste lingered on my tongue as if I had eaten something forbidden. I met Dale by the courthouse steps, his coat still damp from the rain. He moved with that economy of motion that belonged to men who had learned to save energy for when it mattered. "We start at the archives," he said. "Hard copies, the ledger, anything with ink." There are places in small towns that remember better than people do. The county archives is one of them, a narrow room behind the clerk's office where the fluorescent lights buzz and the air smells faintly of paper and old coffee. Rows of boxes sat like sleeping things. Behind the desk, Miriam, the clerk who had worked there longer than the mayor had been alive, looked at us with the polite suspicion of someone who had seen too many requests for gossip dressed up as urgency. "We don't have time for theatrics, Miriam," I said. "Where are accident reports for July of 2003? And anything tied to—" I hesitated, feeling the word like a live wire. "To Holbrook." She let a breath go that might have been a laugh or a concession and pulled a thin file from beneath the counter. "You understand, some things are sealed," she said, voice low. "Some things get tucked for a reason." "Because men like their names neat," Dale said. He folded his hands and set them on the table like an oath. We read through brittle reports and handwritten statements. Most of it was procedural, headlights, skids, routes, but under the typed forms, someone had scratched a name more than once. A notation in a margin, witness later recanted. Another, funds transferred, see ledger. The ledger they meant was not a police ledger, but a town ledger, a record kept by the Holbrook Charitable Trust, the kind of ledger that listed donations and favors with the same ink. Its entries were careful and small, and, when you had a mind for it, telling. There, between a line about a new wing for the library and a check to the Youth League, was an entry in a heavier hand, a payment to A.R. dated July 12, 2003. A.R. could be 1,000 different things, but we had been collecting initials like pebbles, and pebbles become images when you hold them up to the light. "You see this?" Jimbo asked, leaning in with coffee still cooling in his hand. He had the look of a man who'd been pulled from the center of his ordinary life and found, to his own astonishment, that he liked being in the middle of something that mattered. We copied everything we could. Miriam hesitated when she saw us making scans, then simply turned away and continued with her work as if secrecy were the same as normality. After the archives, we visited people who remembered nights better than they remembered days. A waitress named Rhonda, who had been working at a diner on Route 6, a mechanic who'd kept a file of odd repair jobs, a woman who swept the front porch of a house that had once belonged to the Holbrook family. Each interview added small, dirty details. The Barracuda had been seen that night. It had been running the whole time the diner's lights were at half-mast. A man in a dark coat had argued with someone on the phone outside the diner. A woman had run past the windows carrying something small and wrapped. "The thing is," Rhonda said, eyes on the floor, "people look, then they look away. No one wants to be the one who remembers too loud." That bit of confession arrived like a key. It explained the resistance we had felt like a current under skin, the town's preference for sleeping things. It explained why names lived in glove boxes and ledger margins, but not in conversation. When we started to meet resistance of another kind, it was not theatrical. The sheriff came by the diner with a deputation of quiet words. He did not threaten, he reminded. He reminded us there were things the office could do properly. He reminded us of trespass laws and the importance of not interfering with investigations. He spoke of procedure in that tone that pretends procedure is neutral. "What we have is not a court," I told him, and what I meant was that sometimes the tribunal of memory is the only tribunal left. He did not disagree so much as exhale. That afternoon, returning to the office, I found my front window had been opened an inch. The screen was pushed back as if someone had needed air. On the sill, where the rain had left a tidy ring, someone had placed a single sprig of jasmine. Its scent filled the room, and the back of my throat tightened. Tucked beneath it was a scrap of paper, torn from a ledger page. In a hand that hesitated and then went coldly definitive, someone had written, "Leave the past where it sleeps." There are notes that are warnings and notes that are instructions. This one was both. I measured the syllables like a weight and put the paper in my pocket. We had been warned before, by a voice in a radio and by a fog in a mirror. This was the first time a human hand had done the telling. "Someone's watching," Dale said when he saw the jasmine. He closed his eyes for a second and then opened them fast, like a man who had allowed himself to be afraid and then decided to move on. "We keep going." Which is to say, we kept going. The next day, I took a copy of the ledger to the paper, where a young reporter named Elise folded it into her briefcase and looked at me with the fierce practicality of youth. "If we run this," she said, "we'll need proof. Names, dates, money trails. People will call us liars before they call us right." "I don't expect kindness," I said. "I expect accuracy." We found accuracy in slow work. The mechanic's file held a receipt with a partial license number. A bank clerk in a neighboring county, who felt freer to be scrupulous than anyone in our town had been, pulled an old check and, with that peculiar expression archivists and clerks have when they find a thread that goes somewhere, said, "This isn't right," meaning the way the ledger's entries lined up with cash movements, payments that coincided with silences, payments that disappeared into hands that left behind no signatures. That night, the mirror did not whisper. It did not need to. Instead, it showed the Barracuda's backlit taillights in the fog of glass, as if the car were idling at the end of my street. I could smell jasmine without being near any flower. The letters H and W pressed themselves against dark glass, and then sloughed away. The mirror, faithful in its small cruelties, had become less a tool and more a messenger whose language we only partially understood. We began to organize what we had: ledger entries, receipts, witness statements. We cataloged the noises the radio made when it wanted to be understood. We wrote a piece for the paper that read like a ledger itself, precise, patient in the way a wound can be. We were careful. We followed the rules we had laminated and taped to the inside cover of our folder. We kept the mirror uncovered in a place that could be seen. We opened windows for Jasmine to enter, but not to consume. The morning the article was set to run, the town felt like a held breath. I drove to the office feeling the weight of the ledger in the passenger seat like a potential weapon. Dale met me at the door, his face a map of worry and stubbornness. Jimbo was quiet. When Elise called to say the layout had been held at the last minute so the editor could double-check sources, the way she said it made no promise of goodwill. The double-check was a gentle way to call time, to give those who preferred silence a moment to decide whether to act. That evening, as we sat under the same porch where we had mapped our plan, there came the distant, familiar sound of an engine idling, too steady to be a neighbor's. Jimbo stood up and stared down the road. The headlights made the rain look like glass threads. "He came closer," Dale said, and his voice was not entirely sure whether he meant the ghost or the thing that had been the ghost. The idling held just beyond the curve, as if the town itself was listening. Then, with a soft mechanical cough, a car shifted gear and moved away, tire spray tracing a disappearing line through the wet street. We listened to that line unspool into the dark and, like everyone awake that night, felt the peculiar simple truth. Once you begin to name something, it takes its own time to decide how loudly it will fight to remain unnamed. We did not sleep well. Outside, the jasmine fought with the rain for air, and the mirror, reflecting nothing but the room, kept a small, steady watch.